Hi again, everybody, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So you might remember that in the last few episodes, I've been talking about what you might call the history of oneness in the West since the Enlightenment. And of course, so far we've heard from artists, poets, seekers of various sorts, plus researchers in modern psychology, like Maslow last time, for example. And I think it's fair to say that we've detected a trend in the sense that we've found a secularization in the way at least some people have been looking at these experiences of existential oneness, these unitive states, the oceanic feeling, as Freud called it. His friend called it, really. Part of that has been an intensifying interest on the part of scientists in exploring the idea that they might play some natural role or be necessary even in some way for humans to live better lives. Today I'd like to finish off this history by looking at some of the findings of the last few decades maybe. I think, as you might be aware, there have actually been far too many, really, for me to do justice to in one episode. And I'll kind of have to skip over a lot, actually. I'm thinking, for example, of the massive amount of scientific research there's been done since around 1970 in mindfulness practices in their various forms, meditation, yoga, and many others. I think most of us are aware of the myriads of benefits scientists have discovered from mindfulness, both to physical and mental health. These practices have been found to relieve stress and pain. They've been used to treat anxiety, depression, and insomnia, addictions, among other things. Religiosity, with which I think there are a lot of overlaps with mindfulness practice, has also been linked to similar health benefits, including the slowing down of aging, apparently, according to one paper. I'm thinking today, though, that it might be more interesting to focus on one particular example of this kind of research, a paper that seems to offer a particularly fascinating take on what you could call the the science of unitive states, the science of psychic union. You may remember that in the last episode I talked about Abraham Maslow mentioning in his 1964 book the prospect of scientists studying peak experiences, as he called them, in the lab by observing the effects of psychedelic drugs. This scientific study ended up taking longer than I think Maslow would have imagined. Starting at around 1970, countries around the world began to ban these drugs, and this put a chill into research into their possible benefits. But recent years actually have seen a dramatic reversal of this. Scientists have been growing more and more curious about the potential of psychedelic and other formerly recreational drugs like to treat mental health problems, similarly to the way they've looked at mindfulness. In one article on the use of the drug MDMA or ecstasy to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. This was published in May 2021. University of California, San Francisco neuroscientist Jennifer Mitchell told the New York Times, "This is a wonderful, fruitful time for discovery because people are suddenly willing to consider these substances as therapeutics again, which hasn't happened in 50 years." That was in a news article in May 2021. And meanwhile, helped partly by more sophisticated imaging techniques, brain imaging techniques, scientists have been learning more and more about how the brain works, including how the various elements of mental life that we subjectively experience seem to come from specific parts of or neural networks within the brain. There have also, of course, been fascinating developments in the way of neuroplasticity, the tendency for the brain to rewire itself in response to change. Anyway, the paper I'd like to tell you about brings these new attitudes and findings together in a way that seems to suggest how and why unitive states might be good for us in a particularly fascinating way. It's called The Entropic Brain, a theory of conscious states informed by neuroimaging research with psychedelic drugs. And it was written by an 8-member team of scientists led by Robin Carhart Harris, a neurology professor who was working out of Imperial College London when the paper came out in 2011. He's now at University of California, San Francisco. And by the way, this and many other similar papers with similar findings, this paper's available for free on the internet. You could just Google the title if you want more details on it after this episode. Anyway, it essentially argues that the mental states we've been describing as unitive, or at least some of them, are actually a kind of throwback to the kind of consciousness our distant ancestors had before they developed the capacity for abstract thought. But the critical thing is that it's good, or can be good, for the brain to periodically experience these throwbacks, because the same thing that makes abstraction so powerful a gift can also be, according to this theory, bad for the brain in certain ways. The paper starts by describing the state of consciousness under the effect of psychedelic drugs as a, quote, exemplar of a primitive or primary state of consciousness that preceded the development of modern, adult, human, normal waking consciousness. There's a lot of qualifiers there because, for example, he talks about how we do relapse into this, we do seem to in some way relapse into this state in dreaming, for example, and also it's something that develops in us from infancy. So presumably children also live more in this primary state than adults do. Anyway, these unitive, or as he calls them, primary states, are the results of what, according to Carhart Harris, of elevated entropy in a certain network in the brain. So that's elevated disorder, activity becoming in a way more random within a certain network of the brain, which is called the default mode network, or the DMN. Now, the DMN is interesting for a number of reasons. Carhart Harris thinks it might actually be the physical locus of the ego. This is the part in the brain where the ego happens. So he writes, for example, that it seems to serve as, quote, a central orchestrator or conductor of global brain function, unquote. And then he continues, functionally, the DMN is relatively removed from sensory processing and is instead engaged during higher level metacognitive operations such as self-reflection, theory of mind, and mental time travel, functions which may be exclusive to humans. He seems to be talking, to my mind, really about abstraction in its various forms. Anyway, getting back to Carhart Harris, he says, excuse me, DMN connectivity increases through development from birth to adulthood, and DMN regions have undergone significant evolutionary expansion. Despite our knowledge of these things, however, it is poorly understood why the DMN consumes so much of the body's energy, a disproportionate amount compared to other parts of the brain, apparently. This uncertainty regarding the nature of the DMN's disproportionate energy consumption has led to loose analogies being made between it and the dark energy of cosmology. It is consistent with the hypothesis of this paper to suggest, there's a bit of hedging language here, that this apparent excess energy of apparently unknown function residing in the DMN is, in fact, the physical counterpart of the narrative self, or ego. I also find it interesting, by the way, that the two neuroscientists that I've just quoted are both now working at the University of California, San Francisco, which is a part of the world that we all know has played quite an interesting role in the history of altered states of consciousness. Anyway, one of the fascinating things, I know I've used that adjective a lot in this one episode, but I do think it's really quite a remarkable paper. And one of the fascinating things about it is that it talks about thinking basically as the manifestation of a kind of self-suppression or self-constraint in the brain. I, I just think that's interesting because we're used to thinking of thinking as an add-on, an extra capacity that we have, which he's not saying it isn't, but somehow this capacity involves suppressing other brain activity. So he writes, secondary consciousness, the evolved consciousness that humans have, comes from our having evolved an extended ability to suppress entropy and thus organize and constrain cognition. So abstraction, he's saying, is a kind of constrained mental activity. So greater organization, but at the cost of constraining cognition, presumably constraining the way neurons, or at least some of them, grow and function and connect with each other. Of course, we're used to thinking of thinking as a gain, but when you think about it, it really does seem to involve this constraint or suppression. As we talked about in earlier episodes, abstraction really involves the mind pulling bits of reality out from their contexts. And in order to do that, it has to ignore or suppress the essentially infinite, but in a way unformed richness of this content, all the other things that it's taking in, it has to temporarily ignore so it can focus and form this concept, this abstraction. The philosopher Hegel also, whom you might remember William James said he could appreciate only while under the influence of nitrous oxide, notably also talks about negation as inherent to thinking. To focus on anything, it has to say it's a not everything else. He says, he attributes to Spinoza this idea that every determination is a negation. Anyway, in his paper, Carhart-Harris argues, quote, that this entropy-suppressing function of the human brain serves to promote realism, foresight, careful reflection, and an ability to recognize and overcome wishful and paranoid fantasies. Equally, however, it could be seen as exerting a limiting or narrowing influence on consciousness. So by blocking out everything else to focus on and form these concepts, we are able to do these reality checks. We're able to determine that the face we see in the water isn't another me, it's just a reflection. But as we're going to see, there are ways in which abstraction could be limiting on the brain's ability, in other ways, to grasp reality. So, in other words, it's possible, Carhart-Harris is saying, that the human brain has the tendency to over-constrain itself. And in fact, he hypothesizes that mild depression, I guess what you might call this sort of melancholy, could be, quote, an evolutionarily advanced state. He writes, metacognition, and in particularly the human capacity for self-reflection, is an advanced behavior that rests on self-organized activity in the DMN, the default mode network, that the brain, that's particularly engaged when the brain is engaged in self-reflection. And between the DMN and the medial temporal lobes, he sees this as part of normal consciousness, this connectedness between the default mode network and these medial temporal lobes in the brain. The suggestion is that increased DMN activity and connectivity in mild depression promotes concerted introspection and an especially diligent style of reality testing. However, what may be gained in mild depression, i.e. accurate reality testing, may be offset by a reciprocal decrease in flexible or divergent thinking and positive mood, he says. So essentially, the brain has a tendency to fall into ruts. The idea is that it does reality checking obsessively, but somewhat paradoxically, this obsessive reality testing can fall into sort of these stereotyped ways of operating for the brain. in more serious episodes of depression, he writes that cognition is even more constrained. Depressed patients typically perceive themselves and their world through an unyielding pessimism. Depressed patients' cognitive style may become too fixed, such that the patient loses the ability to think and behave in a flexible manner. Underlying this phenomenon may be a decrease in metastability, which that's something he associates actually with disorganized brain activity. So he's saying underlying this phenomenon, there may be a decrease in sort of chaotic brain or somewhat disordered brain activity. So an almost excess of organized brain activity, such that one particular state, e.g. the introspective default mode, comes to dominate cognition. Narrow-mindedness is to pessimism what openness is to optimism, and strategies that promote the latter may be effective treatments for depression. So what psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, he writes, might be doing is essentially bringing the brain back temporarily to its more primitive, less ordered, or more entropic state, thus temporarily lifting its excessive self-constraint and sort of obsessive reality checking. Temporarily, reality checking according to these somewhat overly fixed categories. Temporarily introducing chaos into the way the DMN operates and temporarily disconnecting it from the medial temporal lobes, bringing our thinking, in other words, out of the ruts that it can fall into. And as he puts it, entry into primary states depends on a collapse of the normally highly organized activity within the default mode network and a decoupling between the DMN and the medial temporal lobes, which are normally significantly coupled. He hypothesizes that psychedelics induce a primitive state of consciousness, i.e. primary consciousness, by relinquishing the ego's usual hold on reality. And he puts in parentheses DMN control on MTL, medial temporal lobe activity. It is proposed, he writes, that psychedelics work by dismantling reinforced patterns of negative thought and behavior by breaking down the stable spatiotemporal patterns of brain activity upon which they rest. He includes what he calls an important caveat, though. In order for this process to be beneficial, the drug-induced transitions to and the return from primary consciousness must be mediated by appropriate therapeutic care, moving the brain out of subcritical modes and into unfamiliar terrain may present some risks. By subcritical modes, he means this default way of operating. It may present some risks, e.g. loss of contact with reality and persistent magical or delusional thinking if not properly managed. So yeah, I think this is really a noteworthy paper for a number of reasons actually, but mostly because it seems to provide evidence of the most scientific kind of all the speculations of these artists and seekers of the power of unitive experiences. What Carhart Harris is saying about psilocybin and other psychedelics really is that they, properly managed, presumably under the supervision of healthcare professionals, have this potential to lift us to both truer and happier states. Without using the same words, I think he's really saying that they can relieve there's some potential here to relieve humankind of the existential alienation, because it's really these ruts that abstractive thinking can fall into that separate us from reality. So he's saying that there's this potential for medical science using these drugs to relieve humankind to some extent of the existential alienation and resultant melancholy that we're all prone to as a result of abstractive thinking, by lifting us to states that are happier because they're truer. So I think that's pretty amazing. But now, all that said, I wouldn't have called this channel Platonic Soul if I felt that this was the end of the story. I don't doubt the power of science, including the science we've just talked about, to make us happier. But there's a reason why I think science will never be able to entirely overcome our existential alienation. It's just not, excuse me, it's just not in its nature to do that. I think we need something, there's something else we need. And that's what I'll be starting to talk about next time. So once again, thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time.